Warning, this content may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. What are some of the creepiest experiments ever done in human history? The monster study in 1939 was conducted at an orphanage. They were trying to prove that telling stutterers that their speech was fine would produce a change in their speaking patterns. But they didn't have stutterers at the orphanage, so they just chose 12 kids with perfectly fine speech and attempted to induce a stutter by constantly accusing them of stuttering. The self-esteem of the kids in the stutterer group was destroyed and the kids all became incredibly withdrawn. The video of Russian experiments in keeping a dog's head alive still haunt my psyche. Thank you everyone who is adding a few sentences explaining what actually happened and not just putting the name of the experiments. Y'all are the real MVPs. The Tuskegee syphilis study told African American males that the study would be around a year and that they were receiving free healthcare from the U.S. government. The study actually continued for decades and its purpose was to study the effects of untreated syphilis. Treatment with antibiotics was created after a few years, but the subjects continued without any treatment. Horrific. Camp Hero in Montauk, New York after the military left in the 50s or 60s. Rumors of experiments on kids. Kind of a Stranger Things inspiration. Margaret Halavod and her independent work with dolphins. She had exactly zero professional or academic training in marine biology. At the behest of Drive, John Lilly for a NASA-funded program is absolutely bonkers. Her trying to teach dolphins to speak like humans do using laughably stupid methods, having sex with a dolphin, and when they decide the whole experiment is a failure, it all ends very, very, very sad. The Tuskegee syphilis study, 1932 to 1972, conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service, was unwarranted and cruel. It is having repercussions today with a high percentage of black men who are reluctant to get the COVID vaccination. Milgram shock experiments. They convinced the participants that they had shocked the person to death and had to keep on shocking them until 450 volts, but luckily they were just actors on the other side of the wall. However, there were later experiments based off this where participants actually had to shock a dog frown. Joseph Mengele. I remember hearing about the Nazis doing experiments on kids and women to try to make them get blue eyes and blonde hair. Like they would put different concoctions of chemicals and drip them in their eyes to try and turn them blue, or wash their hair to try and permanently turn it blonde. It creeped me and made me angry at the same time. So there was a woman named Henrietta Lacks who was a poor black woman with 5 children, went to Johns Hopkins University, one of a few hospitals that would see poor black people in its time. She was diagnosed with cervical cancer. The cancer was the first living human cells to multiply outside of the human body in a lab environment. Her cells are still alive and are being used in medical research to this day. Her family didn't know they had her cells until years after it had already been used to create new medicines and was part of hundreds of medical studies. If I'm not mistaken, she died during treatment and her family hasn't seen any money from the research that would be impossible without her cells. The first blood transfusion, sometime in the 1800s. A doctor injected a calf's blood into a madman. He started to sweat and vomit, and he died soon after. In the 50s, young Puerto Rican women would be unknowingly sterilized when they went to the doctor or dentist for treatment. When they had to have minor surgeries, they'd be sterilized. For no reason. They did it so much, at the time, that some towns had empty classrooms for years in a row. Meaning women had pretty much stopped giving birth in certain areas of Puerto Rico during the 50s. America. The Pit of Despair. Look up James Marion Sims, the father of modern gynecology, and how he performed his studies on enslaved black women in America. After that, Tuskegee syphilis study. Finding anesthesia involved some awful experiments. There was an experiment where they tried to induce phobias on a toddler. They would tase him every time he went near a fluffy animal, rabbit, hamster, etc. After some time he started to get uncomfortable next to those animals. The guy lived a seemingly normal life after those experiments. Some people say he didn't like animals, so they might actually have managed to induce the phobia. The MK-Ultra mind control experiment was monstrous in ways that Joseph Mengele would have blanched from, and based on really stupid theories from the start. After the Korean War, Some US pals came back from North Korea still insisting that they had been shown proof of US war crimes against the civilian population in Korea. Since US brass knew that there were no such war crimes, they concluded that the Soviets must have perfected some new technique of mind control. So they tasked the CIA's Mad Science Division with reverse engineering it. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb was a fierce devotee of Konrad Lorenz's imprint theory, and hypothesized that if you tortured someone long enough while dosing them with high enough doses of LSD or other psychedelics, you could return their mind to an infant-like state of imprint vulnerability and then use ordinary hypnosis to imprint whatever beliefs or personality you wanted. Dozens of volunteers, nothing resembling informed consent was given, committed suicide or died under torture. Hundreds ended up permanently mentally crippled. It turns out to be quite easy to shatter a mind. This does nothing to enable you to reassemble it at all, let alone the way you want. A couple of decades later, Korean survivors took American journalists to see the evidence of US war crimes. There is no such thing as mind control. Maybe not the worst, but Vipe home experiments. Definitely cruel. I think the whole stuff in the Second World War and concentration camps, the whole stuff around Unit 731 from Japan and some of the US stuff were really, oof. Also the sleeper agents stuff the CIA pulled in the Cold War with LSD and so on is really creepy. I mean, if you were around any CIA/USA stuff, you never know if they drug you or not. That's kinda creepy. I might be slow to get this in here, but Unit 731, it was a Japanese unit during World War II that did some truly horrific shit. Easily rivaled the Nazi experiments. The experiments on twins performed by Joseph Mendel. The man was a monster who pulled identical twins from prison camps and experimented on them. The CIA did experiments in Montreal where they used LSD in an effort to program assassins and then wipe their memories clean after for obvious reasons. A couple books were written about it. Not really creepy but definitely wild. The Stanford prison experiment, crazy at how fast we can be broken down and basically brainwashed. John R. Brinkley transplanted goat balls into people to make them more virile and youthful and eventually just told them that it would basically cure anything. Nope. Nope, nope, nope. Thought I could take whatever this thread threw at me. Lost it at the dog head and Hisashi ouchie. Unit 731. To give a very simple in a nutshell explanation for those who don't know, it was done by Imperial Japan, yes, the same Imperial Japan that literally raped the populace of the city of Nanjing so hard that there is a statue in Nanjing today that praises a Nazi because of the amount of rapes he stopped by simply walking around with his swastika armband on. This Imperial Japan did something that makes the Holocaust look like a light-hearted joke in comparison. You read that right. Unit 731 makes the Holocaust look like a light-hearted joke. Any experiment by Joseph Mengele. The one where they give a bunch of primates money. One of the monkeys teaches all the other monkeys how to trade high-risk options. The monkeys that got rich stole the poor monkeys' wives, but the poor ones were okay with it. I just listened to a podcast from CBC called Brainwashed. It's about these experiments being done at McGill University in the 50s and early 60s. This doctor, Ewan Cameron, would take people who check themselves into the health center for basic issues like postpartum depression and perform experiments, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy way over the normal amount, putting people into comas and playing repeating phrases over and over to them. Seen Stranger Things? They were definitely influenced by this, oh yeah, and giving people acid without their consent. By the end, some of the people would have reverted back to the stage of being 2-year-olds, not being able to feed themselves or use the washroom, not knowing who they are. Originally he's doing this under the guise of curing mental illness, then it turns out he's being funded by the CIA and cheese. His methods have been used as torture in Guantanamo Bay and elsewhere by the US. It's some really disturbing but fascinating stuff. I definitely recommend the podcast. In World War II Japan, the military arrested thousands of Chinese and some Dutch people. They experimented on them by letting fleas infected with bubonic plague feast on prisoners, or then freezing a person's hand totally and then thawing them to get completely degloved, or then putting a person in a pressure chamber, making them release their bowels and intestine through their anus. This operation was known as the Epidemic Prevention of Water Purification Department. Though they have made a movie on this Man Behind the Sun, and it is the most disturbing movie I've watched, and in it they used an actual footage of an autopsy of a young boy. The experiments the Nazis performed on their Jewish prisoners were awful. Forcing them to drink seawater to see how much salt they could withstand. Taking them up in unpressurized high-altitude planes to see what would kill them, and seeing how long they could survive in cold water, both to aid the Luftwaffe. You can see a data table for the cold experiments on Wikipedia. They killed over 1,000 sets of twins in Auschwitz, usually by experimenting on one, and when they almost inevitably died, only 200 of the 1,500 lived. They would kill the other one and do an autopsy to see what the damage was like, and using the unexperimented on as a control. They did a range of transplant surgeries without anesthesia. They messed around with a bunch of different diseases and treatments. Not quite sure if it qualifies as an experiment, but still horrific all the same. There was a relatively recent period in history where doctors believed that infants weren't capable of feeling pain, so they would perform surgery on them without anesthesia. Oh, they would use enough muscle relaxants to stop them thrashing on the operating table, but anesthesia? PSHH, no need for any of that. It was only declared unethical by the American Academy of Pediatrics in 1987. This article goes into it a little, as well as the medical world's problems with accurately assessing and treating pain as a whole. Dr. Klingman's experiments in Holmesburg Prison. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.